The man they were burying this week has been dead for more than 4 months, and as his coffin moved through the streets of Tehran, the crowd pressed around it wasn't only chanting death to America, it was chanting death to the compromiser. Everyone standing in Iran's government that day knew precisely which compromiser they meant, and the ones who knew best were standing a few feet from the casket, wearing the faces of men who had just been threatened at a funeral. This was supposed to be a show of unity. It became the clearest picture yet of a state coming apart at the seam that runs directly under the price of a barrel of oil. Ali Khamenei ruled Iran for 36 years, and he was killed on the 28th of February, the first day of the war, in a strike that also killed his wife, a daughter, a son-in-law, and a granddaughter who was 3 years old. Iran waited 4 months to bury him because the bombing didn't stop. Now the bombing has paused, the funeral has finally begun, and what the pause revealed is the thing his death was supposed to hide. Nobody is fully in charge, and the men trying to keep the lights on are being called traitors in front of the whole world. It is the 7th of July, 2026, and the largest funeral Iran has ever assembled is not projecting strength, it is broadcasting a fight. This is Professor Alex, and if you want to understand where oil, gas, and the next inflation print are actually being decided right now, take 1 second to subscribe, because this story doesn't end at a graveside. It ends at your local pump. Let me walk you into what happened, because the sequence matters more than the spectacle. When Khamenei was killed in February, Iran did something it had never rehearsed in the open. It reached for a successor. On the 8th of March, the Assembly of Experts named his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader. And then the new supreme leader vanished. Not metaphorically, literally. Mojtaba has not been seen or heard in public since the day his father died. No video, no audio, no photograph taken after February. Iranian posters carry his image across Tehran, but the man himself is a rumor. American and Israeli officials said in March that he had been wounded in the same strike, that his face was disfigured, that one of his legs was badly damaged, and that he may have lost a leg entirely. Reuters reported the same injuries from people close to his circle. And this week, as his father's body finally moved toward burial, the New York Times reported something that tells you everything about how fragile the situation really is. Mojtaba asked to attend the burial, to perform the rites for his own father, and his own security services said no. They refused the supreme leader of Iran permission to bury his father because they were afraid that if he stepped into the open, Israel would kill him, or follow him back to wherever he's hiding. Sit with that for a moment. The most powerful position in the Islamic Republic is currently held by a man his own guards won't let outside. Now put yourself in the crowd. 15 to 20 million people were expected across the week. Tehran's main procession alone drew somewhere between 12 and 15 million by the Financial Times count. And the man they're mourning is present in a coffin, while the man who inherited his authority is absent from the one moment that was designed to transfer legitimacy from father to son. Legitimacy in Iran is not a paperwork exercise. It's performed. It's the picture of the new leader standing over the old one, taking the weight. That picture doesn't exist. It couldn't be taken. So into that vacuum rushed the only thing that fills vacuums in a grieving, humiliated country: rage, and the people who know how to point it. Here's where it stops being a funeral and starts being a market event. The chants this week weren't generic. Alongside death to America and death to Israel, mourners chanted death to the appeaser, death to the compromiser. Negotiations are forbidden. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, one of the men who actually sat across from the United States, was heckled in Karbala by a crowd shouting that they don't want pretense. There were leaflets circulating that read like coded shots across the bow of the pragmatists. There were chants of support for Mojtaba by name, an attempt by one faction to plant its flag on the succession before anyone else could. And underneath all of it sat a document, an agreement, the very thing that has been holding the global oil market together since June, because that's the part the funeral cameras don't linger on. In the middle of June, after months of war, the United States and Iran reached an understanding, a memorandum, a framework. It came with a ceasefire, and the ceasefire came with the single most consequential detail for anyone living in America: the Strait of Hormuz reopened, conditionally, for a window of about 60 days. And the man who led Iran's side of those talks is Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, a former Revolutionary Guard commander who has spent this week being accused by his own hardliners of selling out Iran's control of that waterway. When Ghalibaf went on television and told the country that Iran must not turn the strait against itself, that the strait only has value if traffic through it grows rather than shrinks, he was making an economic argument to a crowd that wants a military one. And the crowd answered by chanting for his prosecution. So why does an American watching this need to care? Let me give you the number that connects the graveside to your grocery bill. When the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed after the war began in late February, oil didn't drift higher, it launched. Brent crude pushed above $120 a barrel. The Energy Information Administration says Middle Eastern producers were shutting in more than 11 million barrels a day by May, unable to move their crude because a fifth of the world's oil traffic runs through a channel Iran sits on top of. Brent averaged $107 in May. That is the world where gasoline gets expensive, where diesel gets expensive, where everything that moves on a truck gets expensive, and where the inflation fight the Federal Reserve thought it had nearly won comes roaring back to life. That was the trajectory. That was the fear. And then the June ceasefire happened, and the entire picture inverted. Watch how fast. Oil didn't just come down, it fell through the floor. As of this week, Brent is trading just above $72, hovering at its lowest levels in more than 4 months. West Texas Intermediate is sitting around $69. The last time WTI closed below $70 was the 27th of February, the day before the war started. Read that again. The oil market has now completely erased the war premium. It is pricing the world as if the conflict never happened. From $120 to $69 in the span of a few weeks, on the strength of one agreement signed by the men currently being called traitors at a funeral. Look at what's driving the collapse, because it's not one thing, it's a stack of them, and each one is louder than the last. Tankers are moving through Hormuz again. Just this week, at least 8 Japan-linked ships exited the strait, including 5 supertankers, each capable of carrying 2 million barrels. OPEC Plus met over the weekend and agreed to raise production quotas by another 188,000 barrels a day, continuing to unwind the cuts it held for years. Saudi exports are climbing back toward pre-war levels. The United Arab Emirates, which actually walked out of OPEC entirely during the conflict, has fully restored its shipping. And then there's the tell that stopped traders cold. Saudi Aramco cut the price of its flagship Arab Light crude to Asian buyers by $11 a barrel, pushing it to a discount against the regional benchmark. The last 2 times Saudi Arabia offered that grade at a discount were 2020 and 2015. Both were price wars. When the Saudis start discounting like it's a price war, they are telling you the supply is coming back faster than the demand can absorb it. For a moment, this looks like unambiguously good news for the American consumer. Cheaper crude flows toward cheaper gasoline. Lower fuel costs cool the inflation numbers. A Federal Reserve that has been staring at sticky prices gets a little more room to breathe. And if you only watched the oil screen, you'd close the tab and feel relieved. But here is the gap that the funeral just exposed, and it's the whole story. The market is pricing peace. The Iranian street is pricing revenge. And those two prices cannot both be right for long. Think about what the oil market is actually assuming when it takes Brent back to $72. It's assuming the ceasefire holds. It's assuming Hormuz stays open. It's assuming that the 60-day window that started in June rolls into a real, durable settlement. And every one of those assumptions runs straight through Ghalibaf and Arachi and Pezeshkian, the pragmatic camp, the negotiators, the people the funeral crowd spent this week describing as compromisers who deserve prosecution. The trade that brought your gas prices down is a bet on the political survival of the exact faction that just got publicly threatened at the most emotionally charged event in the country's recent history. And this is a country that just held its own leadership's future hostage in front of the cameras. The Times of Israel, citing the New York Times, reported that hardliners and pragmatists are now in an open struggle to claim Khamenei's legacy as their own, and that the senior appointments made after the funeral will reveal which side has actually won. That's the open question hanging over every barrel of oil right now, not whether Iran mourns, whether Iran negotiates. Because if the hardliners consolidate, if the doctrine shifts, the first lever they reach for is the one that hurts America directly. The head of Iran's Parliamentary National Security Committee already said this week that the country's armed forces have moved from a deterrent posture to what he called an offensive, deterrent, and regret-inducing one. That is not the language of a state that intends to keep the strait open out of goodwill. Now bring President Trump into the room, because he is not watching this passively. Trump told Axios over the weekend that he's following the funeral closely, that both sides agreed to take a week off from talks while the ceremonies play out, and that during that week, neither side will fire on the other. And then he said something that lands very differently in Tehran than it does in a soundbite. Looking at the sight of Iran's entire leadership gathered in one place, he mused that it would take one shot to take them all out, before adding that they wouldn't do it, because then there'd be no one left to negotiate with. To an American audience, that's bravado. To a grieving Iranian crowd that just watched Israel kill their supreme leader in a strike on his home, it is gasoline poured directly onto the fire the hardliners are already tending. Trump also flew this week to a NATO summit in Ankara, where a senior U.S. official confirmed that security in the Strait of Hormuz is on the agenda. So the same waterway that the funeral crowd is chanting about is sitting on the table at a NATO summit at the same moment. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from two ends of the same rope. And here's the piece almost nobody is connecting, the one that makes this an American story rather than a foreign one. During the months the strait was closed, the United States quietly became the release valve for the entire planet. With Middle Eastern crude bottled up behind Hormuz, the world turned to American barrels. U.S. crude and petroleum product net exports hit a record 5.8 million barrels a day in April. Demand for American diesel and jet fuel climbed. For a stretch of this year, the U.S. wasn't just insulated from the disruption, it was profiting from it, selling into a world that had lost access to a fifth of its oil. That's the strange, uncomfortable arithmetic underneath all of this. American energy producers had a very good war. And now, as the strait reopens and Saudi Arabia starts discounting crude like it's 2020, that advantage compresses. The same reopening that lowers gas at the pump also erases the premium American exporters were collecting. There is no version of this that's simply good or simply bad. There's only the question of which way it breaks and how fast. Which brings us back to the fragility. Because the market's calm is thinner than the price suggests. The EIA is not describing a healed system, it's describing a system running on fumes. Even with prices falling, the agency expects developed world oil inventories to drop to around 2.3 billion barrels by December, the lowest level in its records going back to 2003. On a days of supply basis, that's roughly 50 days of cushion, the thinnest margin it has ever measured. Read those two facts together and you understand the trap. Prices are low because supply is returning, but the buffer underneath those prices has never been thinner. A market with 50 days of supply and a war premium priced entirely out is a market with no shock absorbers left. It only takes one incident to remind everyone of that. And this week, there was an incident. A cargo ship came under attack in the Gulf of Oman near the strait, and a U.S. official pointed to Iran. Iran's foreign minister said plainly that final peace negotiations will stall if the threats against his country continue. That's the man the crowd is calling a compromiser, warning that the deal holding oil together is conditional. So let me put the whole thing back together, because the individual pieces are loud, but the shape they make is louder. Iran is burying a leader it lost in February. The son who inherited his power can't show his face and couldn't attend the burial. The funeral that was meant to prove the state is intact instead put its internal war on live television, with millions of mourners chanting for the prosecution of the very officials keeping the oil flowing. Those officials signed a June agreement that reopened the Strait of Hormuz, and that reopening is the sole reason oil collapsed from $120 to $69, the reason gas prices have eased, the reason the Fed's inflation picture just got a little more forgiving. But that agreement rests on a 60-day window, on the political survival of a faction under open threat, and on a leadership vacuum that could tilt hardline the moment the funeral ends and the appointments begin. The oil market has priced all of that as settled. The street in Tehran is telling you it is anything but. The thing to watch isn't the burial on the 9th, it's the week after. Because whoever is actually holding the pen in Iran right now, Mojtaba if he can, the Revolutionary Guard if he can't, will start naming people to positions. And those names will answer the only question that matters for your fuel costs, your airfare, your winter heating bill, and the next inflation report. Do the pragmatists who reopened the strait keep their grip, or do the men chanting that negotiation is forbidden take the wheel? The market has already placed its bet. It bet on peace, and it bet with real conviction, dragging crude to a 4-month low. Iran just spent a week in black, in the streets, telling the world that bet might be premature. There's a version of the coming months where the ceasefire holds, the strait normalizes, oil settles in the 70s, gasoline stays gentle, and this funeral becomes a footnote. And there's a version where a wounded, unseen supreme leader, or the hardliner speaking in his silence, decides that the men who signed away Iran's leverage over the world's most important waterway are exactly the traitors the crowd said they were. In that version, the 60-day window closes, the strait tightens, and every dollar the oil market took out of the war premium comes flooding back in, all at once, with 50 days of supply and no cushion to catch it. The distance between those two futures is being decided right now, at a graveside, by people who are not thinking about your gas tank at all. So when you fill up this month and it costs a little less than you feared, understand what you're actually paying for. You're not paying for peace. You're paying for a bet on peace, placed on the survival of a few men who spent this week being called compromisers over a coffin. The question worth holding on to is a simple one, and it's the one the market keeps refusing to ask out loud. What happens to everything you pay for when the people keeping that waterway open lose the argument they're currently losing in the street? This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.